Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the early developments of computer music. And we're mostly going to be talking about the development of computer music in the United States. So to start off, when we're talking about computer music, especially in these early days, I'm really going to be talking about two different kinds of computer music. And it's good to kind of keep track in your mind when we talk about specific pieces or specific technologies, kind of which kind of composition or which kind of computer music they were able to make. So the first is computer-aided composition. And what that means is basically that composers used a computer to basically make compositional decisions for them. So they basically made like a music composition program and it would spit out notes, but with computer-aided composition, the computer doesn't necessarily synthesize the sound or generate the sound. So that's distinguished with number two, which is computer-generated audio, which is where the computer synthesizes the sound, or it's digitally synthesized sound. And so what we'll see is in the early days, most of the pieces and the systems that we're going to talk about did computer-aided composition. So computers were programmed to make compositions, but they could not yet generate audio. And then what we'll see by the end of today's lecture, the development of digital synthesis techniques that enabled composers to both use a computer to make compositional decisions and compositional procedures, as well as generate the audio. So again, that's just something that's good to kind of keep in your mind as we're going through these things. So something also to keep in mind is that today, it's most of the music that we listen to is mediated by a computer at one point or another. It's recorded digitally, it's played back digitally, we listen to it on our phones or on our computers via Spotify or YouTube or whatever platform you're listening to, or even on TikTok if it accompanies a video. So most of the music that we're listening to, especially during quarantine, is computer digitally mediated, and the only times in which it's not is if you're out at a concert and maybe you're hearing kind of like a live acoustic set that's maybe minimally mic'd, then that might just be like electronically mediated if it's not going through a digital mixer. But these days it's really hard to encounter music that isn't somehow digitally mediated. So that's just kind of a frame of reference. So to start out with this lecture, we're going to go way back to the early 1800s to talk about Ada Lovelace. And some of you might have already talked about Ada Lovelace in a computer programming class or something like that, because she's often referred to as the first computer programmer. A little bit of her background: she was Lord Byron's daughter, and Lord Byron was a poet in England and sort of a notoriously problematic person. But his daughter, Ada Lovelace, sort of took a different path than he did. She was extremely highly educated, basically had access to like the best tutors in the land. And the one thing you could say about Lord Byron is that he supported his daughter's education. And really early on, she excelled in math and in the sciences. And really from an early age, she was pretty fascinated by machinery. And she kind of designed her own different kind of machines and apparatuses. So for instance, when she was 12, she designed a steam-powered flying machine. And this like predated actual functional airplanes by like decades. So she was really ahead of her time and had a really keen insight into how one could use technology in really, really new ways. So she comes into play with the early developments of computers in 1833 when she meets Charles Babbage. And Charles Babbage was kind of an eccentric engineer and inventor, and he invented first something called the difference engine, which was really like which we can see here. It was really like a calculator. So see how huge this thing is. It required all of this stuff to be able to just do like basic functions that a calculator that we have today could do. And it could do both logarithmic and trigonomic functions. And he also then, after he developed the difference engine, developed something called the analytical engine, which was basically a general purpose computer. It had more or less all the functions that a contemporary computer could do. And it was even programmed using punch cards. So if you know anything about computers in the 19th century, a lot of them were programmed using punch cards. So he was very much like ahead of his time in designing this analytical engine. And something that's important to note about the analytical engine is that it was never actually completed. So it never was actually, it was never able to like fully function in the way that Babbage conceived of it. But he did kind of foresee a lot of the modern developments of computers. So Ada Lovelace comes into play in the story in the 1830s when she meets Babbage, and she starts to translate Babbage's work into French. And what she did was, while she was translating Babbage's work, she also took her own notes. And in her own notes, she really talks and kind of elaborates on Babbage's ideas and really kind of fleshes out some of the other potentials that this analytical engine could be used for. And I think in a lot of ways, she really understood the potential for the analytical engine better than Babbage himself did. And her ideas and her notes were so influential that Alan Turing actually used them when he developed the Colossus during World War II. So we really owe Ada Lovelace a lot. And she wrote about, not just kind of like mathematical or engineering ways in which this analytical engine could be used. She also thought about how it could be used to generate or compose sound. And so we have this really great quote from her notes here where she says, again, the analytical engine might act upon other things besides numbers, were objects found whose mutual fundamental relations could be expressed by those of abstract science of operations, and which should be also susceptible of adaptations to the action of the operating notation and mechanism of the engine. So you can see that she's definitely writing this in the 1840s, a little bit dense. But she says, supposing, for instance, that the fundamental relations of pitched sounds in the science of harmony and of musical composition were susceptible of such expression and adaptations, the engine might compose elaborate and scientific pieces of music of any degree of complexity or extent. So she really she really foresaw the ways in which computers could kind of be used in every aspect of life, including in music. So again, that's why she's kind of relevant to this class, and also part of the reason why she's considered sort of the first computer programmer. Okay, so up next we're going to talk about a few of the early experiments that were where a computer was made to compose music, and they all kind of happened at the same time. So the first we're going to talk about is a computer called the Datatron computer, and you can see a picture of this here. And the Datatron computer was one of those massive mainframe computers that took up an entire room somewhere. And two mathematicians who, and another thing about the Datatron computer is that it was part of industry. It was made by the Electro Data Company, and it was a vacuum tube computer. So this was a corporation that had this computer and used it for different things. And two mathematicians employed by this company, Martin Klein and Douglas Bolitho, had the opportunity to create a program that could generate Tin Pan Alley melodies. And Tin Pan Alley, for those of you that don't know, is basically sort of like early 20th century popular music. It was sort of like Broadway tunes, pop tunes that were often sold as sheet music that people could take home and play and sing themselves at home. And it was, again, kind of early popular music in the early 1900s and late 1800s. And it kind of was a big part of the founding of the music industry at that time. So this is an example of their using of the Datatron computer is an example of automated composition, where they basically, in their program, specified a set of compositional rules, and then they generated a bunch of random numbers that were then sampled and tested against those rules, and then if a number passed the test, it was included in the composition. And so basically, what the program did was it spit out a bunch of numbers, and you can see those numbers here. And those numbers then had to be by hand transcribed into music notation. So that's something that's really important to know about these early programs, is that they were programmed numerically and they spit out numbers that then had to be transcribed into music notation, and then they were played by human musicians. So there was no computer generated sound. The computer didn't just like do its calculations and then like spit out a song. So it popped out numbers that then had to be transcribed into music notation. The most famous of their experiments was called Push Button Bertha, and they even wrote lyrics to accompany it. And this is one of your listenings for this section, so please go back and listen to it. Okay, so that's it for section 1 of lecture 12. And up next, we're going to talk about the developments of computer music at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So we just talked about Push Button Bertha and the Datatron computer, and now we're going to go to the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and another early development in computer music. So in 1955, two chemistry professors, Leonard Isaacson and Lejaron Hiller at the University of Illinois, used the campus's mainframe computer, so again, a huge computer that took up an entire room, called the Iliac computer, to create a program that would make automated compositions. So just like Push Button Bertha, just like the Datatron computer. However, the program that Hiller and Isaacson made was significantly more complicated. However, they did use a very similar method, which is sometimes called the Monte Carlo method, where they basically specified compositional rules, generated random numbers, sampled those random numbers, and then tested those numbers against those rules to create a computer composition. And they used this computer to make a piece called the Iliac Suite, which they finished in 1956. And again, it used the Iliac computer, which is why it is called the Iliac Suite. And this is a string quartet. So again, just like with the Datatron, this computer program generated and spit out numbers that then had to be transcribed by hand by a human into music notation, and then was further played by human musicians. So it was played by an actual string quartet, which is two violins, a viola, and a cello. And again, I mentioned that this was significantly more complicated than Push Button Bertha. So it consisted of 4 different movements, so 4 different sections, and each section used a different set of rules. So each movement used a different set of rules. And just up front, your required listening is movement number 1. And they called each of these movements experiments, which really kind of gives us insight into kind of how they were thinking about this composition. And the rules that they used for the Iliac Suite were basically counterpoint rules, so from the 18th century. So remember when we listened to Bach during the synthesizer lecture, Bach was kind of the kind of music that they were trying to emulate here. And remember, Bach's music is really polyphonic, where it's like there's several different melodies that interweave and happen at the same time. So it's very complicated music. So the first experiment, or the first music, was made using very simple counterpoint rules. And it started with 1 voice, and then used 2 voices, and then 4 voices. So that's 1 line, 2 lines, and then 4 lines. And so it kind of went from very simple to very complicated. And what they did was they basically, when they entered in voices to 2 voices and then 4 voices, they based the rules off of the first voice. So it was kind of like in comparison to that first bass line, or called the cantus firmus. But you don't need to remember that. They basically just, again, kind of used really basic melodic and harmonic rules. And then for experiment number 2, it was 4-part complex counterpoint. So you can see this is the rule set for experiment 1, and this is the rule set for experiment 2. So much more complicated. They have rules about consonance and dissonance, about cadences, which are how you end a musical phrase, about repetitions, about if you can go stepwise in your music or make leaps. So it was really much more complicated. And then experiment 3, they called experimental music, which was basically what they called random chromatic music, or just simple chromatic music. So again, that kind of gets us back to someone like Schoenberg or even Cage with his indeterminate pieces. That's kind of their frame of reference for this piece. And then the last piece was called Markov chain music. And here, if you know how Markov chain works, each note is based on its kind of relative likelihood based on a number of previous notes that were chosen. So it's kind of like conditioned by what happened before. And this was kind of way of using kind of new developments in algorithms and computer programming to develop new kinds of musical procedures and new ways of generating music that are kind of like outside of these simple counterpoint rules. And again, it's really important to remember that they used these rules, and then so they programmed these rules, they generated random numbers, sampled those random numbers, and tested them against these rules, which then again spit out a bunch of numbers which had to be transcribed, and then it was played by an actual string quartet. So when you go to listen to this piece, you'll hear just an acoustic string quartet. And remember, this is an example of computer-aided composition. So the computer did not synthesize the sound for this piece. Next we're going to talk about something that's really interesting about the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and Lejar and Hiller is that Lejar and Hiller, after he created this piece, was so kind of inspired that he really pushed to establish a music studio at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And so in 1958, the experimental music studio was established by Lejar and Hiller and several music professors, and this then became a real center of computer music up to this day, really. And really famous computer musicians kind of went through the school, and it was also a studio for just making electronic music in general. So students were not only trained in how to use computers, they were also trained in how to use magnetic tape and synthesizers and all those things. But this is another studio that was established really around the same time as the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Studio. And it really in some ways kind of operated similarly. I think a lot of this was still sort of in the dominant framework of Western European music. However, I think composers at the University of Illinois tended to have a more distinct voice and more of like started to develop more of like an American style as opposed to the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Center. So, of course, we can't go through any new technology without talking about John Cage. John Cage started to correspond with Lejar and Hiller. Several of his pieces were premiered at the University of Illinois, and so obviously he was very up on kind of like the contemporary developments in kind of new music. So of course he corresponded with Lejar and Hiller, and they worked together from 1967 to 1969 to create this piece called Harpsichord. And you can see here it's abbreviated. This was the name of the music program that they developed. So something that I should have talked about when I talked about the studio in general is that Lejar and Hiller developed an early music programming language called Music Comp. And this was used to create several other programs, including Harpsichord, which is the music program that the piece is named after, a piece called Dice Game, and a program called Dice Game, and a program called I Ching. You can imagine what that was used for. So a little bit about this piece. This piece is a music circus. And so Cage in the 1960s started to explore the idea of abundance by basically just kind of having as much media and as many things going on at one time in his pieces as possible. So Variations 5 is kind of a good example of that, where there's dancers, there's visuals, there's sound, there's just a lot going on at any given time. And this piece, Harpsichord, is another example of that kind of piece. And this piece was inspired by a piece by Mozart. So some of you might know that Mozart was an 18th century composer. He's really famous for his things like concertos and symphonies and operas, basically like a quintessential classical composer. But he did have a sort of experimental edge to him. He improvised a lot, and he also created this piece called the musical dice game, in which he composed a bunch of different measures of music, and then one rolled the dice to put those measures in different orders. And it didn't matter what order the measures were in, it would always sound good. So this idea kind of fascinated Cage because this is kind of an early example of an element of chance in a composition. And of course, we know about Cage that he was really interested in involving chance in his music. So what he did for this piece is he and Hiller created a program called Harpsichord to basically generate 7 harpsichord solos that operated on a principle similar to Mozart's musical dice game, except instead of Cage composing each of these measures, he took measures from pieces by Beethoven, by Mozart, by Schoenberg, by Stockhausen, by himself. So measures from lots of different pieces of music, and then used this computer program to put them in different orders. So you can imagine how kind of jarring that would be. 1 second, or like for 5 seconds you'd hear a measure from a piece by Mozart, and then 5 seconds you'd hear a piece by Schoenberg, and then back and forth. And some of the music was just random. And then he also used an I Ching program to kind of order some of these things as well. Oh, he also used this program called Dice Game to generate 52 tapes. And this here is an example where we start to get into digital sound synthesis. So with these 52 tapes, the computer wasn't only generating the kind of procedure in which the sounds were chosen, but it was also generating the sounds themselves. The performance of this piece also included projections. There were people going around making silk screens and making day-glow smocks for people. So you can imagine it would have just been like a kind of it would overwhelm the senses to experience this piece. The projections were pictures of space from NASA. So you'd get pictures of NASA, these crazy sounds, harpsichords all over the room, other electronically generated sounds being pumped into the space, and then like day glow paint all over the place. So in the last decade, a group put on a sort of reconstruction of the harpsichord pieces, and so I have some videos of that here in the slides, which you can go back and watch yourselves. Okay, so that's it for part 2 of lecture 12, and up next we're going to talk about the developments of computer music at Bell Labs. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the developments of computer music at Bell Telephone Laboratory, or Bell Labs. And we've talked about Bell Labs before, so hopefully you have some reference for it. So at Bell Labs, this is also, again, kind of an indication of how industry really played a role in the development of computer music. And Bell Telephone Laboratory was really kind of unique in that it had a very innovative research and development department in which they gave the people that worked there a lot of funding, a lot of resources, and a ton of freedom. So they could basically kind of experiment with whatever they wanted to. And one of the people in this R&D department was Max Matthews, who was really interested in developing not only digital sound synthesis, but also using computers to make compositional procedures. So his work is really an example of kind of the intersection between computer-aided composition and digitally synthesized sound. So Max Matthews developed a family of music programming languages that we now call the music N languages. And I have here kind of a list of each of the different versions of the music programming music languages. The first was music, music 2, music 3, music 4, music 5, which is why it's now called music N, because that refers to all of the different numbers. And his first was just Music 1 in 1957, and with Music 1 he developed kind of crude digital sound synthesis techniques, and then very quickly he came out with Music 4, and this actually was developed a little bit earlier, but with Music 4 was used for a really, really long time, and it became really widely available at these electronic music studios, so at Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Studio, at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. So basically in the 1960s and 70s, if people wanted to use a computer to make music, they were probably using a music N language. And these languages were so influential that basically they influenced every music language that came after it. Either composers were trying to make something in reaction against the languages or trying to emulate aspects of it. And let's take a step back and talk about kind of what it actually is kind of consist of. So one thing that I think is really interesting about the music N languages is that they're kind of modular. So the first thing that someone does when they're using a music N language is create what are called unit generators. And unit generators are basically programs that model analog circuitry or synthesis techniques. And this, again, is kind of like pre-analog synthesizers. And these are programs or subroutines that can then be combined. And these are kind of the basic things that are used to generate the sounds. And it uses something that's called a score and an orchestra paradigm. So the orchestra is basically made up of unit generators. The orchestra is kind of what sounds are generated. And the orchestra, again, is made up of unit generators that either model analog circuits or synthesis techniques like oscillators and different other kinds of synthesis techniques. And then the score is basically a scheduler, which says when each of these unit generators are going to be activated to make certain kinds of sounds. And so these would be separate programs that then had to be run separately. And again, something that's really important to remember about the music and languages is that they were not real time. So someone had to write all these programs and then wait potentially weeks or months until they could actually run them through a digital to analog converter to actually hear the results. So it's not like the computers we have today, where if we wanted to use a music programming language today, we could write a line of code and then render it and hear it instantly. Or there's programming languages where you can just change knobs and change numbers and you can just hear it immediately, the changes that you're making. This was the opposite of being immediate. You often had to wait a really long time to hear what your program actually sounded like or hear the results of your program. So you can imagine it's kind of like a really cumbersome kind of way to compose music. And something that's important too about the music N languages is that they were especially the latter music N languages were developed in collaboration with an acoustician and an acoustic researcher named Joan Miller, who's pictured here. And this is an example, I think, of a non-white, non-male person, or a non-male person, or how, people that aren't male and aren't white often get left out of these histories. She worked very closely with Matthews to develop these languages and develop ways of using them, but she's often left completely out of these histories, and we don't really know that much about her. She's often, if she's mentioned at all, just says, this was made in collaboration with Joan Miller. But it is important to note that she did work very closely with Matthews to develop these languages. So now we're going to talk about a composer named James Tenney, who was one of the first people that got access to using using the music N languages at Bell Telephone Laboratory. So a little bit of James Tenney's background is that he was one of the first students to study at the experimental music studio at the University of Illinois with LeJarn Hiller, and you can see this is them here. So he's really young when he started here. And he was super interested in using computers to generate compositions, and he also, through working with LeJarn Hiller, became very interested in information theory. And information theory was actually largely developed at Bell Labs by I think he was a mathematician called Claude Shannon. And it's basically just like different ways of measuring and theorizing about how information travels through a channel. And so you can imagine that's really important for thinking about how to make computer music, because it's basically how you put information, musical information, through a channel. And then in 1961, he had the opportunity to work at Bell Labs for about 3 years and compose music using the music and languages. And I'm going to read a little excerpt from this essay that Tenney wrote in 1969 about his time at Bell Labs called Computer Music Experiences. And you can see here he originally called it Computer Music Experiments, which he crossed out. So here we go. He says, I arrived at the Bell Telephone Laboratories in September 1961 with the following musical and intellectual baggage. 1. Numerous instrumental compositions reflecting the influence of Webern and Varese. 2 tape pieces produced in the Electronic Music Laboratory at the University of Illinois, both employing familiar, concrete sounds, modified in various ways. A long paper, Metahodos, a phenomenology of 20th century music and an approach to the study of form, in which a descriptive terminology and certain structural principles were developed, borrowing heavily from Gestalt psychology. The central point of this paper involves the clang, or primary oral Gestalt, and basic laws of perceptual organization of clangs, clang elements, and sequences. A high-order Gestalt unit consisting of several clangs. And that's all just complicated language of saying that Gestalt psychology is like hierarchical psychology. So we wanted to create hierarchical musical systems that were based on how humans perceive sound. 4. A dissatisfaction with all purely synthetic electronic music that I had heard up to that time, particularly with respect to timbre. 5. Ideas stemming from my studies of acoustics, electronics, and especially information theory, begun in Hiller's classes at the University of Illinois. And finally, a growing interest in the work and ideas of John Cage. I leave in March 1964 with 6 tape compositions of computer-generated sounds, of which all but the first were also composed by means of the computer, and several instrumental pieces whose composition involved the computer in one way or another. 2. A far better understanding of the physical basis of timbre and the sense of having achieved a significant extension of the range of timbres possible by synthetic means. 3. A curious history of renunciations of one after another of the traditional attitudes about music, due primarily to the gradually more thorough assimilations of the insights of John Cage. In my 2.5 years here, I have begun many more compositions than I have completed, asked more questions than I could find answers for, and perhaps failed more often than I have succeeded. But I think it could not have been much different. The medium is new and requires new ways of thinking and feeling. 2 years are hardly enough time to have become acclimated to it, but the process has at least been begun. Okay, so that's all I'm going to read for now. And I've linked the rest of this essay as part of your recommended reading, and especially if you're interested in looking at more of things like the eugens, he has diagrams here where you can see the different eugens that he created and how they were connected to create the different timbres and synthesis techniques in his pieces. Okay, so you can see there, I think that it explains sort of a lot of where Tony was coming from and sort of what his goals were, that he was definitely interested in timbre, really influenced by Cage, and kind of incorporating aspects of Cage's compositional practices. And I think one thing that's really interesting about Tony and the fact that he was kind of the first person to use these computers at Bell Labs to make music is that he wanted to make one of the things that he was inspired by with Cage is that he wanted to create computer music in which the outcome was not foreseen. He saw that as being like inherently experimental. And so this idea of kind of indeterminacy is really baked into the early days of computer music. So your required listening piece is a piece called Phases, and the title for this piece comes from his interest in sinusoidal shapes, which he used here to kind of dictate how the sound would progress throughout the piece. And you can see this is basically different sine waves in different phase relationships to each other. So that's why it's called phases. And phases refer to kind of the ups and downs of the troughs and peaks of the different waves. So just to take a step back, for this piece, he wanted to give kind of general aspects of this, create general rules that the computer could then, so that the computer could then like come up and generate with the specifics of the pieces. So he gave general ranges and boundaries, and then the computer again sort of generated specifics. So he dictated these line graphs and gave the ranges. So you see here the outer ranges, and then the means, mathematical means, by which the sound parameters would evolve. And so that's all he specified for the computer for these different parameters. You can see note duration, amplitude, AM note range, upper limit of spectrum, so that refers to the harmonic spectrum. So he specified all these different means and ranges, and then the computer actually made the specific decisions. And this was dictated by hierarchical structures and also stochastic processes. And this was also kind of inspired by his interest in kind of what he says, how sounds happen in the world. That sounds in the world are often governed by randomness, they're often noisy, they're often unstable, and he wanted to kind of capture that in this piece. So this is one of your required listening pieces, so please make sure that you listen to this on your own. And before the end, just to kind of give a little bit of context to what else was going on with Tenney while he was at Bell Labs, is his collaborations with his former partner, Carolee Schneemann. So Carolee Schneemann is a performance artist who at the time was very involved with the Judson Dance Theater. And the Judson Dance Theater was an experimental dance and theater troupe in New York City. And she and Tenney collaborated, or Tenney at least participated in several of her pieces at this time. And one of the pieces that he was a part of while he was at Bell Labs is a piece called Meat Joy. And I had a link to a video here. I'll make sure I give you an updated link at the end of this lecture. But it's basically kind of like an updated ritual in which people dance around in meat bikinis and perform kind of like a new age ritual. So you can see James Tenney frolicking around with these other dancers in a meat bikini in this video. So you can also see this is a picture of Schneemann performing her probably most famous piece called Interior Scroll, in which she pulls a poem out of her vagina and reads it in real time on stage. There's more to the piece, but a lot of her pieces kind of involve her body in this way. And I think now this kind of performance art, I think we all maybe have like a better understanding of it, and it's maybe less taboo than it was at the time. But she really wanted to kind of confront societal taboos and also use her body in ways in which she had agency over how it was depicted. So again, this kind of like prefigures ways in which I think artists tend to use their bodies now. So I do think it's kind of interesting context that, James Tenney was all buttoned up and working in Bell Telephone Laboratories during the day and then running around in a meat bikini at the Judson Dance Theater at night. So that's the end of Lecture 12. If you want to add anything to the discussion, pieces that you thought of, or questions that you have, or things that you want more information about, please add it to the discussion section on Canvas. All right.